Renaissance Space podcast, a place for teachers, leaders, and anyone interested in education to hear a range of different voices discussing all manner of different topics associated with teaching and learning. My name is Margaret Allen, and I'm your host. And I'm absolutely delighted to be talking to Nick Hart and Kelly Buxton. Perhaps we can start with Nick. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thanks, Margaret. My name's Nick. I'm the executive head of an infant and a junior school federation in Maidenhead.
Thank you. Kelly?
Yep, I'm Kelly, and I'm a year 6 leader and year 6 teacher and the reading lead for the junior school.
Fantastic. It's really lovely to have you both here. Obviously, both very important roles, very different roles, but they obviously dovetail very closely together in terms of the outcomes for the children, the outcomes for the trust and for the parents and the rest of your colleagues. So, statutory assessment, such a wonderful title covering all sorts of elements, I'm sure. I don't know who wants to start in terms of what your vision, what your beliefs and what your expected outcomes are from statutory assessment. Maybe it should be from Nick to start with, maybe?
Yeah, okay. I think over the last 7 or 8 years, my views on it have changed quite a lot. As a year 6 teacher, as a deputy head, it was very, very important. It was the results of statutory assessment, particularly in year 6, were something that the whole school was working towards. It was something that we put a lot of resources into, a lot of time into, and admittedly narrowed the curriculum to try and achieve those results in reading and writing and maths. I mean, looking back, at one point we had, I remember when progress measures were, before the pandemic, when progress measures were one of the most important indicators of accountability. I remember we had maths progress measure of like the top 3% in the country or something. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's brilliant. But it definitely came at the expense of a broad experience, a broad curriculum for that group of children. And so moving schools, becoming ahead, being in different situations, and obviously there's changes in education landscape with the Ofsted framework and everything else. That my view on it has changed a lot. I mean, I think that the end point of year 6 statutory assessment, you're going to get the results you're going to get. It's not fair to the children or their destination schools to massively intervene in year 6 to try and chase percentages, when instead we should be looking at what happens in year 3 and in year 4 and in year 5 and in year 6, so children don't fall behind in the first place, so that children have a broad experience of every subject, all the wonderful things that happen in the primary years. And I think if you do those things really well, the results will look after themselves.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think I've heard that several times, how so many factors, but particularly the last 2 years, have given everybody the chance to sit back and reflect a little bit and think, well, how shall we start again in a way? And for you, Kelly, still in that year 6 role, obviously with a lead responsibility as well. How does it look for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting process, having not had them for the past 2 years, to then expect the children to have to do it. And obviously I work on the ground with the children day in, day out, and we don't sort of teach to the test. And it begs the question, who are they doing? Who are the SATs for? We're talking about the year 6 SATs, obviously, in this case, because they don't affect the children's going forward, as in the same way that GCSEs would affect what A levels they could do, or A levels could determine which university course they can get into. So it does feel a lot of pressure on young children who've had 2 very turbulent years. We're finding this year 6, I don't know if it's across the board, but a lot younger, less resilience, and just a lot more emotional. So it just is like, why? Who is it for and why?
Thanks, Kelly. You're touching on well-being and all sorts of things in there. And I'm sure you've probably prompted Nick to say, there was something I wanted to say too.
Yeah, definitely. I think that when parents, for example, have asked, what can I do to support my child for SATs? I think the sensible thing is to reassure parents that SATs aren't for the child. They're not for the family. They're not for anything other than school accountability. And so you hear of schools doing early morning boosters, Easter holiday revision, that kind of thing. They're not going for GCSEs. They're not going for grades that determine their next level of education. I think that's wrong. I think that parents just need to hear the message of encourage your child to come to school every day, work really hard, engage with every lesson. And if you do those things, then great. You'll be learning, you'll be enjoying school. And then SATs are not your concern as a parent.
I think that comes up quite often, actually, in terms of who are the SATs for, and maybe what we do with the results is actually what should be scrutinised rather than how the results are driven or received or gained, particularly when the children are still only 10 and 11.
Yeah. And those beliefs that senior leaders have or year 6 teachers and leaders have about SATs go a long way into the experience of children. And so if you've got a head who believes that they live or die by the proportion of children that get the expected standard, then their actions are going to filter down to teachers, to children, and it will be a stressful experience. And if we go about preparing children in the wrong way, then it's not going to go well anyway. Like they'll be stressed, they'll be worried, they'll be in the completely wrong frame of mind to do the best that they can. I think the preparation for SATs is a really important thing for those working with year 6 that need to think about. So, for example, I don't know where it's come from. I think it's Daisy Christodoulou saying something along the lines of, you don't prepare for a marathon by running lots of marathons. So giving children in year 6 endless practice papers isn't going to necessarily help them perform better on a test. It just gives them a bit more familiarity. It's just doing the same thing. And so I think our approach to preparing children for SATs whilst maintaining a broad and balanced curriculum is sensible. What do you think, Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. There's different ways of looking at it ultimately, because we will give the children in year 6 lots of opportunities to practice in the setting that SATs would take place, just to, as Nick said, familiarise them and to desensitise them so that they don't have all those unknowns, because that's what's scary often, isn't it? The unknown and how it's going to look and what the questions are like and how long I've got and what's the room setup going to be like? What am I going to be able to do? How does it work type thing? So there's that balance I find between preparing them and desensitizing them versus, taking away from teaching time as well. So it's a fine balance. But we've got to stand up there and say from the beginning of the year, don't worry about it. It's not going to affect where you're going in secondary school. They've got this notion that it will stop them from going to their chosen and allocated secondary school, that they're then worried, I'm going to be put in the bottom set.
Right. Yes.
It can be, it's not necessarily, we could say whatever we say and we can, downplay it as much as possible, but there's still those children with that internal pressure or the pressure from home or the, pressure.
Absolutely. And I'm from the era of 11 plus, where it really was, you went to the comp or you went to the grammar. So I agree with that completely. But I also think it's important that it should be recognised much more that the assessment of the children is something you're doing all the time, because you're wanting to make sure that you've got children working at the right levels, not because you want them to pass SATs, but because you want to make sure that there's children that aren't missing out because they aren't really showing the right signs. They're not putting their hands up. I mean, it's much more than that, isn't it? It's not just about getting the answer right.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree in so many ways, because there's children and adults that just don't sit tests well. That it is the unknown, it's the panic, it's the pressure, and they'll perform much better. And the teacher who's with them all day, every day, knows what they're capable of, knows what they true. It's not a reflection of them as a person, the test. And to accept that nationally 60% is the pass is we're failing children anyway in that sense. So they need to be assessed. Schools need to be held accountable as a whole key stage, not just the year 6 teachers. It's a whole key stage.
Absolutely, yes.
Nick said earlier, who alluded to the early intervention. And that's so key and that's so important, and working with those children. And progress for children looks very different. And if they're going to get a piece of paper that says you failed or you passed, but actually I can tell you've made a huge amount of progress, but that's kind of what they get at the end of it. And that's a bit unfair.
Yes, completely. And I think also the parents get hooked into this feeling, don't they? And that isn't helping, because some will deal with that so much better than others. Obviously, the curriculum is so much more than just reading and maths, but they are very strong benchmarks for so much else, particularly reading. And I know, Kelly, we've spoken to you before about the reading approach and the sort of literacy exposure, language development, vocabulary acquisition, all of that good stuff. How do they, in your mind, preparing for maths, preparing for English, obviously they're completely different. How does that sit with the curriculum, with the creative opportunities that you're giving the children?
I guess this is the kind of grey area, isn't it? Because if we're assessing and we're holding schools accountable, and it's based on the curriculum. Yes, you've got the national curriculum, but some parts of the national curriculum so wide, so varied, that you could pick totally different things, and then they're assessing them. But when it's not a tailor-made assessment based on the curriculum we've taught, plus we've had the turbulent past 2 years, so they haven't had time for the full curriculum. We're not in year 6, 7, and in the school, we're not a conveyor belt curriculum. So we haven't covered and had enough time to cover the entire year 6 whilst plugging the gaps from the time they've had off.
Yes.
So, but it's more not just ploughing them through, but teacher assessing and adapting and reflecting constantly to check that they're where they need to be. So the SATs might not actually be a true reflection anyway.
No, and one of the most frustrating things about schools reading curriculum is that sometimes at their worst you just see a daily grind of an extract and then answer some questions that look a bit like SATs questions, when that's not how children get better at reading. That is just reading and answering questions. And you can see why people do it. You can see why schools start doing SAT style questions in year 4 or year 5, because it feels like you're preparing children to do SATs. But why? Like, there's so many more interesting things that children can learn about books and stories and responding to them, other than reading an extract cold and then answering questions. And so I think the best preparation is around making sure they know loads about lots of different things through the wider curriculum. And that's where I think it's a mistake to do more more reading at around SATS time instead of doing more of the wider curriculum, because reading relies on children having a really good general knowledge, knowing a little bit about lots of different things, knowing a wide range of vocabulary, knowing about the world. If they can do those things and they can decode and they can read fluently, then they're going to be fine with reading comprehension strategies, as long as they're kind of familiar with the kind of questions and what's expected. But just plowing through endless examples of extract questions, particularly when they're downloaded off a teacher website and not part of a coherent curriculum, it's no wonder children sometimes switch off from reading, because that's not what reading is.
Yes, really, really the opposite of like encouraging a reading or building a reading for pleasure environment, when children can, like, reading is the key that opens up the rest of the world. And if they're not reading, they're not accessing any other lessons, because every lesson includes a bit of reading in it.
Yes.
And it is, the reading assessment is like a background knowledge check. How much do you know about this topic we've got a text about?
Completely. And that sort of cultural capital, which has been brandished around a little bit, has been incredibly tarnished by the last 2.5 years anyway, because children, if they were having a rich experience outside of school and going to visits and exploring things that weren't just a screen, that's all been impacted in such a huge way. In some ways, I think literacy capital is a much better way of presenting it, because not all children can be culturally good or experienced. So, having spoken about reading and maths, obviously there are other areas of the curriculum which you do really need to keep your finger on the pulse around, which is things like phonics, tables. How do you accommodate those elements without switching away from the rich and broad curriculum that you're hoping the children are going to experience?
Yes, I think that those examples of, say, phonics, reading fluency, times tables, number facts, they're all examples, I think, of a sequence of learning that is hierarchical. If children don't have the building blocks, then they're not going to be able to do the more complex things later on. And so in Key Stage 2, if children are arriving not knowing sounds, not being able to blend reading with a lack of fluency, then those things have to be addressed. But if you then do that at the expense of the wider curriculum, yes, they might become more fluent, but they'll become further and further behind in terms of vocabulary, word knowledge, general knowledge, and that kind of thing. And so one of the ways around that for us is that in Key Stage 2, we screen every child for phonological awareness and reading fluency, so that we can tailor early intervention at the beginning of Year 3 for the children that need it. That helps us to kind of choose the right children, but we've also got decisions to make about when that happens. So we've chosen to do that 20 minutes before the beginning of the day, 8:30 until 9 o'clock, and then the children that need it go and join in their classes, so they don't miss out on the vocabulary development and the general knowledge development that happens in all the other subjects.
Kelly, as someone that's obviously with English particularly, but obviously across the curriculum, how does it fit into your world when you've maybe receiving a child into Year 6 who hasn't had that journey that you would have liked for whatever reason, nobody's fault, just maybe coming to the country, English as a second language, for example? How do you accommodate that in your timetable?
Yeah, it can be really tricky. It's really heartbreaking when you have 10 and 11-year-olds that struggle to read or can't read and have really negative views of themselves as readers. But it's really lovely to watch them grow and flourish and see themselves as readers. And had they had the earlier intervention, they would have come on so much quicker, so much earlier. So that's for children who join us and maybe English is an additional language or haven't been in our school. We have implemented, we've seen this as a concern for us being a junior school.
Yeah.
Not having, or having very little sort of not control, that sounds quite negative, but on how it's taught in the infants, because we're not a primary school.
Yeah.
But we can only do what we can do when we get them, and the earlier we intervene, the better. So we've put that in place. But we adopted a systematic synthetic phonics program over the whole of Key Stage 2, and just trying to remove the stigma that phonics is just for Key Stage 1.
Yeah.
Because it's not. It's how it's a skill for life. It's how adults read unfamiliar words, or how we make sense of unfamiliar words. And there's so many different ways that you can take that. So we've adopted Sounds Right as a whole school this year, which will take a few years to filter through, but is having a great impact already, because children are now saying, oh, I didn't know how to spell that, and now I can. Or you're just giving them skills that they can take forward. And then you can stretch them and challenge them with etymology and morphology if they have a really good understanding. So you can cater for all of them. But again, it's about being really inclusive and keeping everyone in class and doing it together and adjusting where needed.
I think what sits behind all of this is one of the biggest misunderstandings in education that we have at the moment. So let's say like end of year 6, beginning of year 7, there's a gap of several years of what you might call expected attainment. And Mark McCourt talks about this far better than I can, about how to actually do a mastery model of education. And we have maths mastery or a mastery approach, and everyone says they do it, but nobody does it. Nobody does it because it's really, really difficult to do. So on reading, for example, you've got a child that's gone through 7 years of schooling, reception up to year 6, and they're still not reading fluently, and they're still not decoding words well. You get sometimes like the label of dyslexia, or someone says phonics doesn't work, but phonics is just a body of knowledge. It's not a program. It's just the way it's been taught that's not good enough. It's just the early intervention that's not happened. And yet, I mean, barring some real cognitive difficulties, I'm certain that the vast majority of children can learn to read fluently if they're taught properly in the first place. That's not to disparage anything that anyone's done, but we've got classes of 30 children. It's hard for teachers to intervene, to know exactly what a child needs, and to before they get passed up to the next class, and then they might go missing for a bit, mess around with a bit of intervention here and there, and nothing really changes for the child. And that, I think that's what really important underpins all of this, is that we started talking about statutory assessment, but it's the minute by minute decisions that teachers make, the formative assessment and the changes to what they do, that's most important. Like we've massively scaled down all of our summative assessment in the last few years, some of it to do with COVID, some of it deliberate choice. And doing less summative assessment hasn't really made a difference to what children can learn and what teachers can do, because it's not the most important type of assessment. The most important type is checking that children have understood what you're talking about, and then either explaining it better or giving them more time to fully understand what they're doing.
I think, yeah, that's very true. And I think also the differences between assessments. So reading is so much more nuanced, isn't it? And so what you're actually checking in terms of knowledge is much more challenging. Maths, you either know that 2 and 2 makes 4 or you don't. And so being able to pinpoint that bit of information in some ways is easier, but on the other hand, it's so vast.
Yeah.
Conceptual understanding of maths, there are so many different areas.
So for example, in reading, we'll collect, say, standardized assessments of reading less often now, because it's more useful to check on children's reading fluency, or to check which sounds they still can't kind of recognize, or to see if the extent to which they can blend and segment. That's far more useful assessment than a standardized score of 84, which doesn't tell you anything.
And it just depends on the topic.
Yeah, and it depends on the actual the actual test, the extract that was read. I mean, standardized assessments have their place, but we delude ourselves if we think that it's useful for teachers, because it's not. It's useful for comparing cohorts and for looking at national comparisons, but it doesn't make a difference to day-to-day teaching.
Intervention points. I'm just going to finish on that, really. How do you ensure that those children, when you have tested them, I hate saying that because it's so cold, but when you've established that there are gaps, what's the process? Is it pulling children together in groups? You talked about, at the beginning of the day, there may be a group that would be having some additional phonics input. How do you cope with that as a school, as a classroom teacher, as a lead in a key stage?
Yeah, I mean, I might have different views. I might have the same views. I'm sure Nick will intervene, but my view is that the teacher is the best person to do the intervention. 100%. TAs are invaluable, absolutely invaluable, but there's no time to there's very little time. Time is the problem, is a wicked school problem, isn't it? Time. Yes. There's no time for anything. So trying to get time to get together with a TA and pass on everything you want, but as a teacher the child so well, and who's grasped what in the lesson or who needs a bit more work, and you're with them all the time. And the TAs are a really invaluable source of telling you, I went round and so-and-so's not quite there, but they're too shy, they're too shy to work. They have a very different relationship with the children. They have maybe a bit more of a personable relationship, and they can read the children really well. And the teacher's just constantly assessing the room and walking around, but maybe is working with a particular group. So I think the teacher's best suited. So flexible grouping within a class, so that, if you're happy, get started, we've done it together, I've modelled it, off you go if you're happy, but you're working silently, so that I can work with whoever wants a little bit more help. And if you want help, I'm going to do the first one, we can do it together. But you're not sort of saying, right, you're all prior Laura Taylor, so you're always going to be in my group, because that's not the case. They might be brilliant at shape but not understand ratio that well. So it's flexible grouping, it's got to be that. And then I think it's allowing time or using the strengths of the adults in the room so that teachers can intervene at various points throughout the day. But like Nick said, that's not taking them out.
No.
Because they don't want to be out of those lessons.
No. It's reinforcing the yellow table concept, really, isn't it? In terms of, that child begins to understand where they sit and why they sit where they sit.
Yeah. They don't want to be taken out of PE art, things that they feel successful in, things that they love, to do things they know they're not so great at. So it's finding the appropriate times and building that in. And I'm sure Nick's going to jump in any minute and talk about how you can build it in as a leader into the school day. But just from my experience in my team, we all have we're all working towards the same values, have the same ideas, that the teacher is best suited for the intervention, and then building up and upskilling our support staff so that they're using their strengths and the things they're really passionate about, so that then frees us up for a little bit of time to work one-to-one.
Fantastic.
Where needed, where it comes up. It's not sort of an everyday, this is what we're doing type thing, or you're never going to be an assembly because you're needed to work on this.
Extra input. So we're coming towards the end. So maybe what I'll do is ask Nick to respond to that, but in a sort of summing up, to ensure that we have a view as the leader, that broad and balanced curriculum that allows teachers to teach, children to learn, but with assessment that is informing, developing, and helping shape that curriculum. I wonder if, Nick, you'd like to respond to that?
Yeah. So from a leader's point of view, you need a system. You need a system that enables all those things to happen. Kelly described the culture in a year group that's really important about who's the best placed to intervene, and how that might work. But across a key stage, across a school, across multiple schools, you need systems that run, but those systems are dependent on resources. So we have an ideal system, but we don't have, I think, the resources to to do that all the time. So an ideal system, for example, will be all the things that Kelly said, plus the opportunity for keep up interventions at sensible times. Or when I say keep up interventions, I just mean 5 minutes, 10 minutes here and there, extra time for children to have a misconception explained or to practice further so that they're ready for the next lesson. That is, I think, is the ideal system, but it requires time in the school day to do that. We've tried to do that with a daily assembly just before break time. And it also requires enough adults to do that. And I don't know, I'm probably speaking for many schools at the moment that school budgets and everything else are difficult, and that having the perfect number of adults is probably not achievable. And so part of the system that schools that need to think of is TA deployment. I think the days of a TA per class are probably long gone, and that using TAs for their particular strengths is really useful. So if you've got a TA that really loves teaching art because they're artistic and they're brilliant at it, then let them teach art. Teacher can intervene. If you've got a TA that's really good at supporting with reading fluency, that really gets the whole repeated reading and other fluency strategies, then let them do that with multiple children. That means that those TAs are not only doing what they love, but they're doing what they're good at, and helping children that need it at the right time. But I think that all of that is also dependent on having a curriculum that is sensible. And so the curriculum is overloaded, not because the national curriculum is overloaded, because we've overcomplicated it. Sometimes the curriculum is too activity based instead of really specifying the small things that children need to know and understand and be able to do from subject to subject. If we kind of narrow that down, make it really clear, then we don't have running out of time. And I think that's a massive contribution. I think if you're taking recommendations, you really need to speak to Matt Swain from, I think, the Step Academy in Sussex about this, because his system for doing this is amazing.
Well, I need to speak to him then, don't I? And I'd also actually like to come back to you at some point to look at the Key Stage 1 impact and how that is different, because it is different, obviously, for all the reasons we don't need to articulate. But what I would like to say to you both is thank you very much for taking this time out to talk to me and to share with us all that you have. It's really lovely to hear you both sort of bouncing off each other, recognizing each other's roles, but respecting professionally what you each bring to what is obviously a powerful, engaging place for the children to be. And for that, I'll say thank you on behalf of the parents, but I'm sure, and I hope that they do that too. And I'm sure that your children, as you are looking forward to a wonderful break, and hope to speak to you again sometime.
Thank you, Margaret.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget that you can catch up on all previous episodes at www.renlearn.co.uk/podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of the Renaissance Space podcast, please check out the Education Joining the Dots podcast from our colleagues at GL Assessment. Thank you.